AITA for refusing to help my in-laws financially after realizing they're taking advantage of me and my wife. I never thought I would be the villain of the family, but here I am, the heartless, cold, ungrateful son-in-law who dared to say, enough is enough. Apparently, having boundaries makes me a monster. For years, my wife and I have been financially supporting her parents. It started off small, and at the time, it felt reasonable. Her parents had always struggled with money, and my wife, being the compassionate and loyal daughter she is, felt an obligation to help them out whenever they were in a tight spot. The first few times they came to us, it was for things that seemed legitimate: overdue utility bills, car repairs, a sudden medical expense. I didn't question it. Family helps family, right? But over the years, it became a pattern. It was never a one-time emergency, it was always something. A mortgage payment they had somehow fallen behind on. A medical bill they couldn't handle. A sudden expense that, if not taken care of, would completely upend their lives. And every time, we helped. It wasn't even really a conversation anymore. They needed money, my wife felt obligated, and I agreed because, well, what else were we supposed to do? Let them sink. At first, I convinced myself it was just bad luck. Some people are just dealt a rough hand in life, and her parents always seem to be struggling. But then I started noticing something that didn't sit right with me. Every time we helped them out, within days, sometimes even hours, they would suddenly have money to splurge on things that didn't exactly scream financial hardship. A new handbag for my mother-in-law. A fancy dinner at a high-end restaurant. Tickets to a concert. At first, I brushed it off. Maybe they needed a little happiness in their lives. Maybe they just wanted to feel normal. But it kept happening. Over and over. The excuses piled up. My wife always had a reason for them. Maybe it was a gift. Maybe they used an old gift card. Maybe they saved up for that before their financial issue came up. And because I love my wife, I bit my tongue. But deep down, something wasn't adding up. The final straw came last month. My mother-in-law called my wife, sobbing on the phone about how they were in serious trouble. She told my wife that they had overdue medical bills and were drowning. She said that if they didn't get help, they didn't know how they were going to afford basic necessities. My wife, naturally, panicked. We wired them a significant amount of money. It wasn't just some spare cash we had lying around, it was money we could have used for our own savings, for our future. But we told ourselves it was necessary. This was an emergency. And then, a few days later, my mother-in-law posted on Facebook. Much needed getaway. Relaxation at last. The pictures were clear as day. She and my father-in-law were at a luxury resort, drinks in hand, grinning ear to ear like they didn't have a care in the world. They weren't struggling. They weren't drowning. They had played us, and we fell for it. Again. I showed my wife, and for the first time, I saw doubt in her eyes. But she still tried to defend them. Maybe they had this plan before the medical bills came up. Maybe they used a different credit card. Maybe a friend paid for it. But the more I dug, the more obvious it became. There were no overdue medical bills. They had lied, straight to our faces, just to fund their little vacation. That was it for me. I told my wife we were done. No more money. No more bailing them out. If they could afford a luxury resort, they could afford to figure out their own damn finances. My wife was hesitant. I could see her struggling with it. She has always felt responsible for them, like it was her duty to take care of them. But even she couldn't deny how messed up this was. So, we agreed. No more handouts. When we broke the news to them, they lost it. My mother-in-law called us ungrateful, crying about how we were abandoning them. My father-in-law accused me of manipulating my wife, telling her that I was turning her against her own family. Then they dragged other relatives into it. Suddenly, we were getting messages from cousins, aunts, and even family friends, all saying the same thing, but their family. You have the money, why wouldn't you help? They raised your wife, you owe them. And now my wife is second-guessing everything. She keeps asking if we're making the right decision, if maybe we're being too harsh. Meanwhile, I feel like I'm losing my mind because, somehow, I'm the villain for not wanting to be taken advantage of anymore. I don't know what to do. I love my wife, and I understand why this is so hard for her. But I cannot keep lighting money on fire for people who refuse to be responsible adults. And yet, here I am, the bad guy. Update 1. We thought that after a categorical no, they, if they did not change, would at least leave us alone. How wrong we were. For the first few days, it was quiet. Too quiet. The kind of silence that feels unnatural, oppressive, almost staged. No phone calls from my mother-in-law dripping with passive-aggressive concern. No desperate texts from my father-in-law detailing some new financial disaster that only we could solve. No guilt-tripping messages from extended family reminding us that family takes care of each other. Nothing. It was like they had vanished overnight. My wife and I cautiously allowed ourselves to believe that maybe they had finally gotten the message. That the reality of no longer being able to siphon money from us had forced them into facing their own financial responsibilities. That, whether they liked it or not, they had no choice but to finally stand on their own 2 feet. But something about the silence didn't sit right with me. It wasn't just an absence of contact, it was a vacuum, an intentional withholding, the kind of silence meant to create doubt, to make us feel the discomfort of it. Like a petulant child holding their breath, waiting for someone to panic. And sure enough, it started working on my wife. The first day or two, she seemed relieved. The weight of their constant demands lifted. But by the 3rd or 4th day, I could see the unease creeping in. She started checking her phone more often. Wondering aloud if everything was okay with them. Overanalyzing their lack of response, as if this sudden absence of manipulation was somehow a red flag in itself. I could feel her unraveling, her deeply ingrained sense of duty fighting against the logical part of her that knew we were being taken advantage of. And then, right when she was at her most vulnerable, the call came. 2 weeks after we severed the financial connection, her mother called. The moment my wife answered, I knew. I could hear the sobs through the speaker before my wife even put the phone to her ear. Hysterical, dramatic, gasping like she had just barely found the strength to make the call at all. She said she was sick. That the stress of our betrayal had become too much for her. That her heart couldn't take it, that the pain of what we had done was literally making her ill. That she could hardly get out of bed. That her body was shutting down from the emotional torment of knowing her own daughter had abandoned her in her time of need. My wife's face went pale, her fingers tightening around the phone, eyes already glassy with tears. She didn't know what to do. How could she know what to do? Her mother was ill. She needed medication. She needed care. And of course, they had no money for it. I watched my wife unravel in real time. It was like watching someone be dragged under by a rip current, caught between the logic of knowing she should swim parallel to the shore and the panic of feeling like she was already drowning. Her parents had conditioned her well. This was the moment they had spent years preparing her for. The mere idea that her mother might be suffering because of her decision was unbearable for her. That's what they had ingrained in her since childhood, that her role was to fix, to sacrifice, to make things better no matter the cost to herself. It wasn't just money to her. It was an emotional contract. The second her mother started crying, it was like she owed her something. But I had heard this song before. I had memorized the lyrics. I had seen the performance, watched every act unfold in perfect sequence. This wasn't a cry for help, it was a test. A demand. A power play wrapped in the illusion of desperation. And I wasn't buying a single word of it. I suggested something simple. If her mother was truly sick, if she really needed medicine, then she could prove it. All she had to do was send us a photo of the prescriptions. A diagnosis from the doctor. Anything tangible that showed this wasn't just another manipulation tactic. If there was a real medical issue, we weren't monsters. We would find a way to help, whether that meant sending her the actual medicine or covering it directly with the pharmacy. What we wouldn't do, under any circumstances, was put money into their hands again. The response was immediate and explosive. There wasn't a single beat of hesitation, no moment of consideration. Just rage. An offended, furious outburst about how dare we question her. Her mother gasped and sobbed, her voice shaking with the kind of indignation only a master manipulator can summon. She raged about how heartless we had become, about how my wife had changed, about how she couldn't believe her own daughter would be so cruel, so cold, so unrecognizable. And of course, the cherry on top, the emotional dagger meant to cut the deepest, was her accusing us of forcing her into this condition in the first place. That if anything happened to her, if she died from the sheer stress and heartbreak of our betrayal, it would be our fault. She would make sure everyone knew that her own daughter had abandoned her in her final days. My wife crumbled under the weight of it, spiraling into guilt and doubt. I could see it happening, her mother's words sinking in like venom, poisoning the small, fragile part of her that had dared to hope for freedom from this cycle. And for a moment, I almost saw her break, the way she had so many times before. But I had reached my limit. I wasn't going to stand by and watch them manipulate her again. They weren't asking for help. They were demanding unquestioning obedience. This wasn't about money. It never had been. It was about control. The second we put conditions on our generosity, the mask slipped. They weren't actually looking for a solution to a problem. They just wanted to maintain the dynamic they had always relied on, one where my wife existed to serve them, where they could twist and contort reality until she felt like she owed them something, until she handed over whatever they wanted just to stop feeling like the villain in a story they had written for her. And then, as if the universe itself wanted to underline my point, it happened. A few days later, my mother-in-law posted a photo on Instagram. A beautifully arranged fruit platter. A plush white robe. A spa menu in the background. The caption: "I love taking care of myself." There were no more heart problems. Update 2. A month after our categorical refusal to finance their difficulties, we received an unexpected call from my father-in-law. By that point, I had assumed they had either given up or found a new target for their financial manipulations. They had gone silent, no guilt-tripping messages, no dramatic health scares, no extended relatives swooping in to tell us how heartless we were. It was almost unnerving how quickly they had gone from wailing about their suffering to radio silence. The absence of their usual theatrics should have been a relief, but instead, it felt like a void, a pause before the next act of their ongoing performance. My wife, though hesitant to admit it, had started to relax. She had been carrying the weight of their constant demands for years, a burden she had convinced herself was hers to bear. But now, without their relentless crises gnawing at her every waking moment, she was lighter. She smiled more, she slept better, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she wasn't waiting for the next emotional ambush. Still, in the back of my mind, I knew it was only a matter of time before they resurfaced. People like them don't just stop. They regroup. They strategize. And when they come back with something bigger. When my wife's phone rang and his name flashed on the screen, I immediately felt that familiar tension coil in my chest. I recognized the number instantly, and I knew there were only two possible reasons for this call: either they had cooked up a fresh crisis designed to lure us back in, or they had escalated to something even worse. I could see the conflict in my wife's face as she hesitated, fingers hovering over the screen. We both knew that ignoring it would only delay the inevitable. So, with a quiet sigh, she answered. I expected the usual routine, the exhausted, beaten-down voice of a man on the brink of disaster, another sob story, another manufactured emergency that only we could solve. But this time, his tone was different. He wasn't pleading. He wasn't playing the victim. He sounded composed. Sure of himself. Almost smug. And that's when I knew this wasn't just another desperate attempt to wring money out of us. This was something else entirely. He told my wife that it was time we paid them back. Not help them, not support them, repay them. He claimed that years ago, when we had first gotten married, he and my mother-in-law had taken out a loan for us. That at the time, when we were struggling to afford a decent apartment, they had stepped in as loving parents and secretly shouldered that burden. That they had never told us about this debt because they didn't want us to feel guilty. That they had carried it for years, without complaint, out of the goodness of their hearts. But now, after all this time, their own financial struggles had become too much to bear, and it was only fair, only right, that we finally paid them back. I felt my grip tighten on the arm of the couch. The sheer audacity of it almost knocked the wind out of me. It wasn't just a lie, it was a deliberate rewrite of history. A carefully crafted fabrication, designed to back us into a corner. There was no loan. There had never been a loan. These were people who had never once lifted a financial finger for us, who had never so much as chipped in for a dinner, let alone taken on a massive debt in our name. My wife and I had worked. We had saved. We had built our lives together from the ground up, without a single dime from them. And now, suddenly, at the exact moment we cut them off, they conveniently remembered a long-buried financial favor. I could hardly hold back my laughter. It was so absurd, so utterly detached from reality, that for a brief second, I almost admired the sheer boldness of it. They weren't even asking for money anymore. They had abandoned the pretense of need, discarded the act of helplessness. They had moved on to full-blown entitlement. This wasn't begging. This was demanding. In their minds, we owed them. And they had convinced themselves that if they said it with enough confidence, if they delivered the lie with enough conviction, we might actually fall for it. I glanced at my wife, waiting for the familiar signs of her internal struggle, the mental gymnastics she always went through to justify their behavior. But this time, she didn't rush to their defense. She didn't grasp for explanations. She didn't try to soften the situation. She just sat there, still and quiet, her expression unreadable. The silence stretched between us, thick and heavy. And for the first time, I think my father-in-law started to realize that his performance wasn't landing the way he had expected. Then she spoke. Calm, measured, steady. She told him that if he could find even one document, just one piece of proof, that showed they had taken out a loan for us, that they had ever paid for anything on our behalf, that there was any record of this so-called debt they had carried on their shoulders for years, then they should show it. The response? A long, stuttering moment of angry mumbling. Update 3. If I thought they would give up, then I clearly underestimated their resourcefulness. A few more weeks passed without contact, and for the first time in years, life felt peaceful. My wife and I almost believed they had finally resigned themselves to our decision, that they had exhausted their schemes and had no choice but to accept that the well had dried up. No more guilt trips, no more fabricated crises, no more manipulative pleas. The silence stretched on, and with each day that passed, the weight on my wife's shoulders seemed to lift a little more. Then my birthday came. My wife, wanting to do something special, planned a surprise dinner at one of my favorite restaurants. It was a place I had always loved, intimate, dimly lit, with incredible food and a warm atmosphere. She made the reservation, kept everything secret, and when we arrived, I could see the excitement in her eyes. It was meant to be a night just for us, a celebration of everything we had built together, free from the burdens of the past. For the first time in a long while, it felt like we were finally stepping into a life that was truly ours. We were halfway through our meal, laughing over shared memories, when the shift in energy was immediate. It started as a slight prickling at the back of my neck, that uncanny sense of being watched. Then, in the periphery of my vision, I saw them. My mother-in-law and father-in-law, standing just inside the entrance, scanning the room. The fact that they had found us was disturbing enough. This was not a restaurant they typically frequented, it wasn't even in a part of town they ever visited. There was no chance this was a coincidence. And then the theater began. They approached the table, their faces stretching into exaggerated expressions of surprise, as if they had just stumbled upon us by pure accident. Loudly, they remarked on how unexpected this was, how crazy it was that they had ended up at the same restaurant, at the same time. Their voices carried through the quiet dining space, ensuring that everyone nearby could hear them. It was calculated. This wasn't just a run-in. This was a performance. Then, the script changed. Their feigned excitement turned to solemnity. They sighed heavily, shifting their weight, lowering their voices just enough to make it sound personal but loud enough that other diners could still catch fragments of their words. They began talking about how difficult things had been for them, how they could no longer afford a normal meal, how they had been living on nothing but pasta and ketchup. They spoke as if they were confessing a great hardship, painting themselves as the tragic protagonists of an unfair story. My wife and I sat frozen. This wasn't just an attempt to guilt us, it was an ambush. They knew exactly what they were doing. This was about public pressure. They weren't looking for a private conversation. They were creating an audience, ensuring that we were backed into a corner where doing nothing would make us appear heartless. I could feel my wife's tension, the way her body stiffened beside me. The moment was engineered to prey on her worst fears. It wasn't just about the money anymore, it was about reputation. About forcing us into submission by making sure we were watched, scrutinized. If we didn't cave, we wouldn't just be disappointing them, we would be exposing ourselves as ungrateful children in front of an entire room of strangers. And then, my mother-in-law played her trump card. Right there, in the middle of the restaurant, she started crying. Not a quiet, dignified weeping. No, this was theatrical, loud, attention-grabbing. Her shoulders shook, her breath hitched, and then, as if on cue, she wailed about how we had done this to them. How we had abandoned them after all they had sacrificed. She sobbed that they had given us everything, that they had raised my wife with nothing but love and devotion, and now, when they were at their lowest, we couldn't even help a little. Heads turned. Forks paused mid-air. Murmurs rippled through the restaurant. It was exactly what she wanted. Now, we weren't just a couple enjoying a quiet dinner. We were two ungrateful children being confronted by their heartbroken, suffering parents. She had managed to shift the entire power dynamic in a matter of minutes. But we had seen too much, endured too much, to fall for it anymore. We stood up. Calmly, without reacting to the stares around us, without feeding into the spectacle they had created. My wife, her voice steady in a way I hadn't heard before, simply stated that we weren't going to discuss money anymore. If they wanted to talk about something else, they were welcome to. But money was off the table. And just like that, the performance unraveled. The shift was immediate, like a switch being flipped. Their expressions darkened, their postures stiffened. Gone was the heartbroken mother and the devastated father. In their place were two angry, exposed manipulators, their strategy crumbling before their eyes. They had expected us to crack under the weight of public scrutiny, to cave in the face of their forced spectacle. They hadn't prepared for us to simply walk away. The explosion came next. Accusations flew, insults hurled with venom, all pretense of sadness abandoned. Their voices rose, their words sharp and biting. If they couldn't guilt us, they would try to shame us. They would try to humiliate us into compliance. But it didn't work. We turned, ignoring the whispers, the curious glances from the other diners, and walked straight out the door. We didn't look back. We didn't apologize. We didn't explain ourselves to anyone. And behind us, my mother-in-law and father-in-law stood there, alone, their random show falling apart before it could reach its final act. My wife didn't cry anymore after that. The first time she said to me, "It's not my responsibility anymore." And that was the moment I realized, we really broke out.